Yep. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to introduce Yannick Schindler from, was it Ellison Innovation?
The Ellison Institute of Technology.
Thank you. Okay, yeah. Forget the breakdown in Oxford. Yeah, and he's been doing a lot of work on how to tease out the causal drivers of a bunch of, like economically relevant systems. Yeah. Welcome, Yannick.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity to present. So my name is Yannick Schindler, and usually well, first of all, thanks for the invite. And I have to say, usually I'm a little hesitant presenting economic stuff to non-economics audiences. Makes me a bit nervous, but I've been doing a lot more of it in recent times, so I was welcome this opportunity. And the reason that I've been doing it a bit more is because I've been working for the past 2 years at the Ellison Institute, which is this new research institute based out in Oxford, which has the very humble mission of trying to make progress on some of humanity's enduring challenges. And in particular, we focus on both like fundamental and basic research, but we also want to make sure that we focus on the entire pipeline of how a great idea, a great scientific discovery goes to impacting a lot of people's lives. And part of that is also understanding the economic systems and the incentives and the institutions in which scientific progress then actually goes on to scale in a market, what type of firms and services and products are required to scale it. And that's basically where me and my group come in. My background is training in macroeconomics, but I've wide-ranging interests in economic topics. Specifically at EIT, currently I lead a group of smaller teams that are researching the economic and societal impact of AI and robotics, with a particular focus also on how those things, or how those new technologies impact science and innovation. But what I want to do in the talk today is just give you a little bit of a taste of how economists address the science that they have to do, or the research that they have to do. We study very complex systems. There's a very nice Feynman quote which says, like, imagine how much harder physics would be if electrons had feelings. And that's very much, I think, encapsulates how difficult research in economics can be. But I want to show you just some of the methods that we use for causal inference in our discipline. The ideal outcome would be if you see something that's useful for the work that you do yourself. But if not that, then at the very least, you'll be able to understand better how economists think about some of these problems. And because I think, sooner or later, you're probably going to run into an economist, and you may even have to persuade him or her or something. So that's the aim of today. So I can't see anyone, but Greg, is all running all good?
Oh, it's all good. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So the roadmap for today is that I basically want to set out what the fundamental problem is that I think not just economists, but basically anyone who practices any type of science or research is trying to solve. So we're just all on the same page. Then I want to briefly address sort of what I see as the main paradigm or culture within economics that defines the approach that economists take to modeling. And then also give you a couple of, or an overview of the kinds of tools that economists like to use, and then hopefully make a lot of that very tangible in a couple of case studies of some of the work that I've done in the past, but also other people's work that I hope you find interesting. I'm also, by the way, very happy to take questions throughout. I can't right now see the Google Meet interface, so just unmute yourself and ask a question whenever. But I'm also happy to leave some time at the end to just do a general Q&A. So I think fundamentally, and probably this is a risk at sort of oversimplifying everything, but I think all of us who do research or do any type of modeling, we really want to know what happens when we change one thing in terms of what that outcome or what change that might engender in something else. So if X changes, what happens to Y? In economics, that might be at the macroeconomic level. We might be interested in knowing, if the central bank in the US changes interest rates by 50 basis points, what might happen to employment or growth of the economy? the microeconomic level, we might be interested in knowing what an additional year of education might do to someone's wages when they're whatever in midlife. What does an additional $1,000 spent on a public education system generate in terms of educational outcomes? In your disciplines, you're all going to have, I think, certain questions I think map quite well, obviously, to this very basic simplification of, we're trying to perturb one thing and then better understand what the causal link is between that change to some interest that to some outcome that we are interested in. In my time at the Ellison Institute, so the nice thing about the Ellison Institute is that you get to rub shoulders with loads of people who are not economists. Economists are nice, but I think, it's also nice to rub shoulders with people that are doing chemistry or biology. And in particular, I've been spending a lot of time talking with people who do a lot of AI and machine learning. And in those conversations, I've come to learn a lot about actually the culture within economics. So it's been a great way to sort of have a mirror held up to your own discipline. And in developing also my thinking about how my colleagues in AI and machine learning think about things and how I think about things, I came across a particular paper that's probably familiar to many of you, is less familiar to me, by Leo Breiman, the title of which is Statistical Modeling the Two Cultures. And I've just taken that and basically I'm going to claim that in economic modeling, we really only have the one culture. But the way Breiman sets this up is he says very much similar to me, like we're generally interested in some variable X. When there's a change in that, what happens to Y? And he says that, in between X and Y, there's this big thing called nature, and it's very hard to understand nature. It's very hard to understand how this mapping from X to Y happens out there in the real world. And he then goes on to posit that there's really, within statistical modeling, and I'm sure that this is perhaps a little bit dated now because this is almost over, it's over 20 years ago that this was written, but there's basically these two cultures. And one is what he calls the data modeling culture, which say that, oh, well, when X changes, that maps to some change in Y via these specified data generating processes or these models. So for example, a linear model or a nonlinear model or a logistic function that maps X to Y. But then he says there's also this other approach, which is to say, well, if we're trying to understand how X impacts Y, that's a pretty nasty black box that we're trying to uncover that's mapping X to Y. So this other approach just takes the development of different algorithms. So for example, decision trees or I think what's obviously now more popular, neural nets, to try to infer this mapping of how a change in X translates to a change in Y. And then he goes on to say, well, I think about 2% of statisticians are in the latter category, and 98% are in the former. But with economists, it's like way worse. Like I think predominantly economists are of the data modeling culture and very much like to write down a data generating process for how they think a particular thing impacts something else. Now, of course, I didn't want to put zero on the right-hand side because I'm sure there are many edge cases, and I think also, especially now, people are shifting a bit more to better understanding how some of these insights from the second culture can help work in economics, but predominantly it's really been that one, the data modeling culture. Where economists are very different, though, is that, and so in Leo's paper, he basically says, okay, well, we validate models in that data modeling culture by looking at goodness of fit tests. Economists very much don't care about that. They care much less about prediction and predictive accuracy than they care about ensuring that the estimation that they're doing or the estimator that they're using is able to infer the true parameters of whatever data generating process that they've written down. So that's really the thing that you would have to clear in an economics seminar, whereas no one reports sort of R squared or goodness of fit in that sense. And so that is what I think makes a lot of econometrics very distinct from statistics. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a broad overview of how, over sort of having studied economics for a while now, but also talking to other people who do statistics and ML, but also in other disciplines, think about just this fundamental problem that I think we're all trying to solve.
Question. So you described the methodology, but it seems like the drivers behind them is how much causality is a driver of the motivation, and how much, if I may, how smart the practitioners think they are compared to the complexity of the domain. I mean, physicists would usually be on the left side, for example, because they're domain scientists who understand their domain. So, like, how does that, the application being causal and prior knowledge, affect the split?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, maybe let me do 3 slides and then it'll become a bit clear. But was the last bit about sort of how prior knowledge about the system itself might impact why some people are in economics are on the left versus on the right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I think very few people would still, even if they took a really strong stance on their prior knowledge or theory of the particular system that they're studying, would then end up on the right-hand side. And I'll show you now, hopefully, an example, like a very contrived toy example of how economists will actually take prior knowledge and theory as a first step to trying to work out what they should be putting in this box on the left-hand side. But I don't think that a lot of prior knowledge about these systems, let's say you get someone who's an expert in whatever public education, you just understand the system really well, would ever move as a function of their knowledge of that problem to the right-hand side. That prior knowledge seems to almost exclusively impact how we approach choosing the functional form that is in this left-hand side. But maybe in the example I'm about to give, that becomes slightly more clear. So again, revisiting this basic problem, we want to know what happens to y when x changes, and economists is going to write down usually some type of explicit function of how they think x maps to y. But the problem that they encounter is that, well, in an ideal world, we would put all the covariates possibly relevant to this particular question on the right-hand side, but oftentimes we just don't have that. So you might be interested in understanding what the relationship is between, again, education and earnings. And so, you might have a lot of data and you might say, well, we know really specifically how much education people are getting. We know their parental education. We kind of know where they live. We know what they had for breakfast every day. We know their teachers. And so you're throwing a lot of stuff on the right-hand side, and you're trying to look at the coefficient on years of education on the right-hand side to see whether, what the effect size is of an additional year of whatever high school on my earnings when I'm 50. But the problem is always going to be that in these types of analyses, there's always going to be something that we can't, in principle, or at least with the data that's available to us, account for. So maybe it's something cognitive, like maybe I'm just really good at paying attention to things. And so as a result, because I'm good at paying attention to things, I just like school more. And so I choose to get some additional years of schooling after high school. But also that attention is making it much easier for me to hold down whatever, a law job or whatever it may be. Like I can sit in an office for a long time. And so the education really has nothing to do with my ability to take a high-paying job. It's really just this cognition. We just weren't able to control for that in our analysis or in our regression, and this creates this confounding that basically plagues quite a lot of the empirical work in economics. And then just to map that also to a more concrete statistical object that economists tend to really care about, for whatever reason, they really care about differences in averages across groups, rather than sort of thinking a bit more about the distribution of those outcomes. I generalize a little bit. Of course, we care about the distribution of outcomes as well, but one thing that we really care about is these average treatment effects. And basically we want to know, we take some group and we study, again, I don't know, workplace accidents as a function of your age and how long you've worked at the place, but also whether you attended a safety program. We want to know what the effectiveness of that program is. And in an ideal world, we would have some information on 100 workers who are exactly identical. There's the same group of people who attended the course, but then also counterfactually didn't attend the course, and we could compare those. That'd be great. But of course, unless you have a time machine and you can go back and force all those 100 people who did take the course to not take the course, we will never have that perfect counterfactual. And so a lot of economic causal inference revolves around trying to estimate some type of counterfactual that we can convince ourselves and others of, to say, well, this group that didn't take the safety course is a really good counterfactual for the group that did. And how might we do that? Let me give you the canonical example that we usually teach sort of at the undergrad in economics. Comes from trying to better understand what the impact of going to war is on people's later life outcomes, like their affinity for engaging in, like, basically in ending up with problems like alcoholism, or their retirement rates, or their earnings. Now, of course, the people who end up going to war may be highly self-selected. Some people have an affinity for that kind of thing, or less of a dislike of it than others, and that might play an important role in then also shaping their later life outcomes. But sometimes we get a nice opportunity to be able to estimate a good counterfactual for a group that did go to war. And in this particular example, it would have been the draft, because depending on the exact sort of setup that you study in the US, the Vietnam draft was effectively random based on your date of birth within a year. And so you can take people who were born on a Wednesday, compare them to people who were born on a Thursday, but it turns out, because they got an unlucky draft draw, that the Thursday people ended up with a much higher probability being in Vietnam than the Wednesday people. And I'll show a couple more examples of exactly that kind of reasoning. What I just described to you is what I think a lot of economic empirical work has converged to, which is this exploitation of what we call these natural experiments. Again, in the war example, we would just love to have to run this massive experiment where we just randomly send people off into a war zone and study their trajectories over their lifetimes and compare them to people who we didn't send. But that obviously has some, ethical implications. And so we look for examples out there where the randomization has happened for us, and where we then have some data to exploit that randomization. So the Vietnam Draft War was one such example of where we are relatively confident that we can have this randomization effectively amongst some groups of the population who ended up going or not going. Sometimes in population health, and I'll have a population health example later, people find out like very curious examples of this. For example, again, it's a military example, but there was a paper recently that studied the impact of water contamination. And it turned out that when you went to sort of boot camp for the US Army, you were randomized into which boot camp you went. And that randomization truly was like as good as truly random. Like, it didn't correlate with your age or where you were from, but really the military, for whatever reason, wanted to randomly allocate people to one boot camp or the other. But it turned out that one boot camp was really close to a water source that had been contaminated, and so you could then study the outcome of these recruits later in life. The other alternative is, of course, controlled experiments, and that is much rarer in economics. One subdiscipline in economics where that is more common is in development economics. So there's been a history or a tradition of being able to run some randomized control trials. So, for example, choosing some areas within a country that are going to get a little bit of extra education about contraception and compare that to other areas in the country. But these are very expensive to run, and people have some concerns about the external validity. So if you run that experiment in a couple of villages in Namibia, like, are you sure that the estimates that you're getting on the effect of contraceptive education are really going to carry over well to contraceptive use and the impact of education on that in Togo or in whatever, Germany? And so for that reason, there's a lot of focus on natural experiments where the experiment has happened in the past, and hopefully we have good data on it. I just heard a little mic turn off, so I don't know if someone wants to ask a question.
Yeah. So this goes towards, like, in ML would be bias, where some bias is good, some bias is bad. My training population and my prediction population is very similar. Then I have one bias. I want to, my model to incorporate all the biases that are unique to the situation. But in your example, if you want to trade in Namibia and predict somewhere else, that's you don't want too much bias. And so how does the notion of bias from ML connect to this true underlying causality or something like that, or maybe lack of confounding is the connective tissue there?
I think it's almost identical in the sense that, I guess, if you were to train like a massive ML model that predicts whether someone engages in contraceptive use or not in Namibia, and you found that it had really poor predictive accuracy in whatever the Ukraine, and you think that that's due to bias, and that's very much similar to even having identified a causal driver that, I guess it gets almost philosophical, that is quite specific to this group in Namibia, or even the setting in Namibia, in the sense that if you just moved all the Ukrainians down to live in Namibia, then whatever, because of the weather there that's different, or because of whatever the tax system is different, that those impacts that you estimated or predicted in your model don't apply anymore. And so I guess in some sense that gets to like what we actually think are these deep parameters that I was saying on an earlier slide, are the parameters in the true DGP, and the true data generating process. Because I guess I'm allowing now for there to be one true parameter in Namibia and another one in the Ukraine. So yeah, I think it's a similar problem in that you get the bias in ML in the same way that your treatment effect is heterogeneous across populations. In my case, across from Namibians versus people in Togo or in Germany.
And then I guess what's the analogy, or it sounds like in economics, you just think hard about what the confounders must be, and whether your randomization like is independent of this shift you want, right? Because you have to have a notion of the kind of generalization you want to have, but like you care about its contraception, but not, I don't know, a surgery. You don't want to transition from one to the other. So is that right? Like most of the process?
That's exactly right. I think economists try to think very carefully about whether the data that they have, and whether then the variation that they have on the right-hand side of their regression equation, I guess you would call it a prediction model, is what we would call exogenous, or is not correlated with anything that is possibly confounding that system. And so I'll have an example from my own work where I study the impacts of a bank failure. So sometimes banks go under, and we want to know what their impact is on businesses. And there, it really comes down to convincing ourselves that this variation in whether a particular business banked with a bank that ultimately fails is orthogonal to any of the other confounding things. So maybe you might say, oh, but smaller businesses are the ones that really select into banks that ultimately fail, and small businesses are just more fragile. Well, then, say, well, no, but we control for small, for the size of the businesses and so forth. But generally, you can do this ad nauseum, right? You could always come up with another possible confounder. And that's why we like these natural experiments, where we then say, well, actually, we've really, in the lottery example, just unless you were able to go back and change your birth certificate, and people who can change their birth certificate are just a bit more cunning and hence have better end of life or later life outcomes. In the absence of being able to convince of that, then that lottery example really shuts down any concern that there may be confounding.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. But no, great question. So thanks for asking. So there's some controlled experimentation, but we also, and this gets, I think, what you were getting at earlier, we sometimes just try to write down models that we think capture the main cause and effect mechanisms that are at play in a particular setting. So obviously the model is going to be very different if we're studying educational outcomes versus outcomes in financial markets versus whatever outcomes in international trade. But really the point there is to try to help us be formal and disciplined in working out how this change in one thing might then flow into a change in the other thing. But also in writing down formal models, it can actually help us then also with how we think about doing causal inference in the empirical setting. So I'm going to try to make that more concrete with a very risky example for me, because I've spent basically, I stopped studying physics in high school, so I'm going to get this probably terribly wrong. But I thought, because probably there are very few economists in the audience, I thought might as well make this tangible with a physical example, but it is an example of a basic physical or mechanical system. You've got some gas in a cylinder, and you've got a piston that's resting above it. And really the point I'm just trying to make is that in this system, there's going to be some equilibrium where that piston is at rest. It's not moving anymore because the forces that push up on it are equal to the forces that push down on it. And so if you in this basic system were to, let's say, vary the temperature, but a naive observer doesn't know you're varying the temperature, big capital T, and then saw a lot of P and V, so gas pressure and gas volume pairs in the data, and then try to say like, oh, well, I have all this observational data. Let me now infer what the gas law is in this particular system. They would fail because the relationship or the data that's the model or the underlying mechanism that's generating these P and V pairs is simultaneously and jointly determining P and V as this third variable T is varying. And so in particular, what you would be able to infer from those pressure and volume pairs that you see in the data is actually the piston balance curve in P and V space, because you've got this variation in T that's impacting the relationship between P and V in the gas law, but that T doesn't enter into the piston balance equation, so the second equation on the slide. And here I'm trying to illustrate that if you know the fundamental laws that are, or the structure of the model that you are, or the system that you're trying to better understand, then that helps you also understand how that data was generated and how you can use that data to do inference about the particular model. In this case, it would be that you can't really infer much about, that what you'll be tracing out in the data is actually the piston balance and so curve. And in economics, probably you've been exposed to this in introductory econ at some point, but we have a very similar notion that we think a lot of the systems that we study are equilibrium systems. So they are at some sort of equilibrium with many variables that we're interested in studying actually being jointly and simultaneously determined. So the simplest is think about a setting where you have a market where there's some sellers selling some quantity of good and buyers supplying some quantity of good. Now, of course, how much quantity a seller might want to supply to this market is going to be a function of many things, but importantly, it's going to be a function of for what price they can sell that good at. For buyers, equally, the total demand for particular goods is going to demand on many things. Maybe their total income, maybe their preference for particular good. I don't know, ice cream sells better on hot days, umbrellas better on rainy days, but also it's going to depend on the price of umbrellas and ice cream. And if you then just add a little bit of, so you say, again, you write down these, what we would call structural equations. And so that is, I think, what you were getting at earlier, which is this applying our prior knowledge or some theory of the system that we're studying to the problem. We very quickly see, oh, if we were to naively now look at the cloud of points generated by the system over time, this be the market for ice cream, and we see all of these quantities and these prices, and we were just to try to do some analysis on this to try to infer what the demand curve might be or the supply curve, we'd be in a bit of trouble because we don't know which of these curves is shifting around to generate this data. And so in this particular example, what we really want to shift around, for example, to trace out the relationship between quantity supplied and the price, is we want only demand shifters. So we would want to look at days, for example, where there was a forecast of sun, but for whatever reason, it was really rainy. And so we think, okay, that's pretty much an orthogonal shock to the system that's going to push up just demand, but it shouldn't change the supply of ice cream that day because suppliers weren't able to anticipate that shock. And then we can be more convinced that the variation that we're seeing in P is really the one that's going to help us trace out the supply curve. So hopefully this makes a bit more, gets at your question of earlier of sometimes not just saying that, oh, there's this kind of black box between X and Y, but also bringing in some of our theory or knowledge, prior knowledge about a particular system.
Okay, so an
Um,
example of
yeah.
the physics would be like a drunk person holding the piston and just randomly moving it up and down to break the correlations.
I think so. I'll stick to my own domain, but like it would be really great if the central bank chief just sort of like, as he's making a decision on what the interest rate should be in a particular month, slips up or something, and then we can be, and he keeps slipping up, and we don't anticipate that he slips up, and so then we can be convinced, oh, for 12 month period in 2025. That variation we're seeing in the interest rate really is completely unanticipated by all market participants. And so we can really consider these as shocks. So if you want, yeah, like if we could get central bankers to randomly be drunk on the day that they're supposed to communicate their interest rate decisions, we would arrive at a setting where we could really do a good job studying the impact of interest rate shocks on the economy.
Right. But narrowing more precisely, it's that you're worried about causal link or built-in correlation between the expectation of phenomenon and the actual phenomenon. So expectation of interest rates, real interest rates, expectation of rate, real rate. And in this case, what you want to do is randomize the connection that are coupled. You want to break that correlation because the covariance being, it's normally not zero, and that messes things up. And you want to force it to zero via your randomization or what's it called?
The natural experiments.
Health trials or like that, random assignment to health trials tries to break suspected, non-causal correlations.
Exactly. Yeah. So we want to, I think you were honing in on the sort of bit at the bottom. We really want to break this covariance between anything that might be in the error term, which might include confounding variables. So again, in my earnings and education example, that might be my ability to sit down and pay attention to stuff longer than my peer. And so if you can find examples where, again, epsilon is going to encapsulate this cognitive ability that I can't measure because I don't have the data, but you can convince me, no, I found a really good example where the amount of education someone gets is totally orthogonal to any of that cognitive stuff and any other possible stuff that's in epsilon, then you'd have convinced someone that you're estimating correctly the impact of an additional year of education on earnings or whatever it may be that you want to study as an outcome.
Right. Thank you.
Of course. So to give you a bit of an idea of how some of these natural experiments or how we think about causal impacts in real economic practice, I want to show you an example from a paper that I've written that studies the impact of the failure of banks on small business lending. So the background of this is that during the financial crisis, but also during other periods in US history, we sometimes get some distress in the financial sector. So what I'm plotting here is basically what society or financial markets thought was the value of Lehman Brothers. So that probably was, I don't know what the total market valuation of Lehman Brothers was before its bankruptcy, but it must have been possibly billions. But within the span of a year went to zero. And that coincided with a time in US economic history where the unemployment rate rose dramatically. And if you were just to kind of look at this as we all have priors, right, about how the economy works or how financial distress might impact real outcomes. But if you really put all those priors aside, it's kind of weird to look and say that this stuff that's happening on the balance sheets of a bunch of banks, like, why does that result in like so many fewer people working at Ford Motor Company putting cars together, or so fewer people being employed at restaurants? Like, it just doesn't immediately make a lot of sense. So this question of how things that are distressing or that cause interruptions in financial markets impact what we would call a real outcome, such as how many people are employed, how quickly the economy grows, has been a big question in economics, at least for 100 years now, since the Great Depression, but it also got renewed attention during the financial crisis. That question was really hard to study in context of very small businesses, because in the US, we have very little data on what small business banks with which one. So, if you go to your favorite taco shop, wherever it may be, there's no good data set that's going to tell you that that taco shop banks with Wells Fargo or with Bank of America. And so I spent a lot of time in my PhD basically building this massive data set. We collect 30 million loan documents to really work out which taco shop banks with Wells Fargo, which taco shop banks with Bank of America. And then we can also go and find a couple of banks, small banks, community banks. So really whatever, Tulsa City Community Bank, and not Lehman Brothers, and trace out what the impact of that failure is on small businesses. Why is this kind of a weird context in that when I say a bank fails, for these smaller banks that we focus on, it's almost just a notional change in who the bank is. So the canonical example of this is that you might be, again, running a small restaurant in a small town in New Jersey, and you might be banking with Maple River Community Bank, but the banking regulator decides that Maple River is very close to being insolvent. They want to avoid that there is a run on the bank or that distress at that bank results in contagion to other banks. And so they're going to use their powers, their regulatory powers, to actually force Maple River Community Bank to be purchased by another bank. And that other bank is usually kind of a much healthier, always a much healthier, but also usually larger bank. But from your perspective as the business owner, Friday night, you'll get after financial markets close, you get a news flash that says, oh, sorry, Maple River Community Bank has closed, but don't worry, your deposits are safe. You can still do online banking. Monday morning, and by the way, River Chase Bank has agreed to take the bank over, so it's going to assume all of its assets and its liabilities. So you now have a new bank. Congrats. And you might think, well, that's maybe what's it really matter if you're banking with Maple River or whether you're banking with River Chase? Is really just changing the logo on the letterhead or on the online banking. And so that's the question we try to get at. And we have these thousands of small businesses, we know, or tens of thousands, and we know who they bank with. We can then compare businesses who experience a bank failure in a given year, whatever it may be, versus similar businesses that that bank with a bank that ultimately never failed. And we trace out some of these estimates and find that, yeah, like if you bank with a bank that fails, it's really bad for the small business. They're much more likely to go out of business themselves. They're much slower in hiring. They have far fewer sales. And we also make sure that we compare sort of in the years, up 10 years prior to the bank failing, whether there's any divergence between these businesses whose bank fails versus the business whose bank doesn't fail. We really see no divergence until right the moment where the bank fails. And we do a variety of statistical tests to check whether like there's some strategic switching where like the smart businesses are the ones who are like, oh, the bank's going to fail, so let me quickly switch to another bank, and that leaves all the bad firms banking with the bank that fails. So there could be some like sample selection that happens right before the bank fails, but we don't see any evidence of that. We can also sort of just throw all those observations out and say, no, you need to have formed your banking relationships 3 years prior to the failure when really no one could have predicted it. But nevertheless, you might be concerned that there's some sort of selection happening and that some businesses are just sort of poorly managed. They're like, they love debt and they love being highly leveraged, and they then go and seek out very risky banks. And as a consequence, then those banks are more likely to fail. The business themselves are just more likely to fail because they're highly leveraged. And so we're getting a spurious correlation, right? So that's really the problem that me and my co-author had to address. And we have a couple of methods. So one is we think about the businesses. So this is just an example from Manhattan. Just consider firm A and firm B. They're the triangles. They're surrounded by a variety of different bank branches. I'm just going to call it Yellow Bank and Purple Bank. Neither of those businesses has a bank partner yet, so they're free to choose. And what we're finding is that actually proximity, like geographic distance to a particular, to the branches of a particular bank, are actually a huge driver in whether business banks with a particular bank, which is weird because obviously online banking should mean that you don't really have to walk to the branch to do anything. But for whatever reason, like geographic distance matters a lot. And so we look at events where, at least, so in the window of 10 years prior to the failure to 5 years prior to the failure. So really when bank health, there's no way to predict which bank will fail. some banks buy the branches of other banks, and this may happen for a variety of reasons. They're just expanding. They want to, go into a new business line, whatever it may be. And we exploit those events because, for example, here you can see that firm B is surrounded by, like, the closest branches to it are yellow bank and a couple of purples, but firm A has a little bit more exposure to yellow branches. But then again, this is like 7 years before the failures happen. Some acquisition event happens, and firm A, actually the bank access around it changes by a little bit, and it doesn't change much around firm B. So I'll flash sort of back and forth. So the yellow bank, purple bank buys a bunch of yellow bank branches, and that's going to add to firm A's menu of purple branches, but it really leaves firm B's access to purple branches kind of unchanged. And what we argue is that that thing which happened 7 years prior, which is a bank acquisition, could have in no way been predicted by the owner of a 5-person restaurant who, chooses their a bank really not based off of where they think this bank may be in 5 years' time. In fact, they seem to just choose branches that are kind of close to them. And so we use this acquisition that happened so many years prior as what we call an instrument. So we use that as our exogenous variation, the probability that you pick a particular bank, but then purple bank ends up failing 7 years later. And so now we can look at firm A and compare it to firm B. Of course, we do this over thousands or tens of thousands of businesses. The firm Bs will have had no change 7 years prior to their bank access. Firm As will have had some change to their bank access. But that change in bank access we argue is like completely orthogonal to whether that business down the line then is a sort of highly leveraged business or whether it is poorly managed. And we find that, these instruments work well, and they still predict that even though the only reason really you ended up with a higher probability of being exposed to a bank failure was because of some event 7 years ago that exposed you a little bit more geographically in terms of your bank choice, means you're also then that we're getting this estimate that's clean of any selection that might be, or confounding that might be biasing our estimates. Another example is from a peculiarity in how you can run banks in the United States. So if you have one bank, but you're not satisfied, you want to own more banks, you can actually start more banks, but put them all into one legal entity. So you can create a bank holding group. And so you'll own whatever, maybe 3 banks in that bank holding group. They're all distinct entities. They all have their own banking license. They're all managed by the same, by their own people. But what ended up happening is that these owners of multiple banks realized that they could put all the bad assets into one of the banks and let that bank fail. And then the bank regulator and the taxpayer would have to foot the bill for that failure. And so the bank regulator in the United States went to Congress and said, this isn't great. We've created this incentive in this bank holding group structure for people to really just put bad assets into one bank, and then that creates this, we'll call this moral hazard problem. So please give us the power to, if a bank fails, to first go to the remaining banks in the banking group and ask them to pay for that failure, so that we can shut down this perverse incentive of just filling up banks with bad assets and letting them fail. And we have one really great example of this, which is a banking group called FBOC Corporation, had a bunch of banks around the country, predominantly in California. Those Californian banks were very large. And then there's a bank that belongs to that group, but it's in Chicago, called Park National Bank. It's very small. And Park National Bank, during the financial crisis, was more or less unaffected. It was a healthy bank. It hadn't engaged in a lot of the mortgage lending or the lending practices that got the other banks in trouble. But the banks in California, which were much larger, all had to be closed down. And then almost symbolically, the FDIC went to that small bank that's left in Chicago and said, you're footing the bill for these sister banks of yours that have failed. And that amounted to whatever, it was 20 times the assets available in Park National Bank. So Park National Bank also had to close. And that creates this great natural experiment for us, because That Park National Bank was really a bank that should not have failed had it not been for these banks that were operating in a completely different country, operating completely separate from it, in a separate state, completely on their own operating terms, but because of a regulatory rule, actually ended up being liable for those banks. And so we can then trace what happens to businesses that were attached to Park National Bank to argue that this was effectively the closing of an otherwise healthy bank, and that shuts down any concerns about selection or many sort of confounding. Let me skip this bit in the interest of time, but another natural experiment that I quite like is from a paper that came out in Nature last year, which finds this really surprising link between the shingles vaccine and dementia. And they also exploit a very nice natural experiment, which is at some point the Welsh government decides that they're going to make a certain population in Wales eligible for the for this vaccine and others not. And basically, you had to be younger than 80 on a particular date in 2013, I believe. And that meant that if your week of birth was prior to the 2nd of September 1933, you remained ineligible. But if you were born in a week after 2nd of September 1933, you were eligible. And then the authors show us this set of panels, and they say, well, look, like in panel A, we clearly see that this is so what the dots plot is whether this is an average of people within a particular week relative to 2nd September 1933, whether they take this vaccine. When we clearly see, no one before it takes it. They could have bought it privately, but they didn't. And then the ones that were eligible, so anyone born in the weeks after 2nd September 1933, do see this like huge uptick in the taking this particular vaccine. And the key thing here is to argue that these people who were born literally like a couple of days before 2nd September 1933 and born after 1933 are effectively identical on average to one another, with the only exception that one group, the one that was born later, had a much higher uptake of this particular vaccine. And they tried to do that by looking at all the data that they do have and telling us, look, there seems to be no sort of discontinuity at the same cutoff in terms of other health behaviors, such as getting other vaccines, having any other sort of diagnosis for a relevant disease, so shingles itself or dementia itself. And they then argue, well, look, we really think that there can be no confounding here because birth dates through the year are relatively uniform. Like people don't really plan it. No one in 1932 who was, gonna have a baby in 9 months in the future was thinking, 80 years from now, the Welsh government or whatever, or I don't know how much later it is, but many decades later is going to decide on this particular rule. And so let's have this kid, let's consummate like sooner rather than later. And so the argument is that, okay, like people born before 2nd September 1933 and after are effectively identical. And the key bit that they show us is they say, well, again, they say none of these other outcomes seem to move much at that cutoff, but we do see this statistical signal that people who were born just after, so we're a bit younger, at the time when the vaccine gets rolled out, just then also in subsequent years have lower dementia onset. And so this was just I think an interesting little case of using a particularly suitable natural experiment to get at a question like this. The last thing that I want to cover is another piece of work that I've done with my co-author, Peter Lambert. And so what we really get motivated by is we look at millions of job adverts and online profiles of workers. So it's effectively, choose your favorite job profile portal. This has been aggregated, and we can see these. And what we see is that there's been this really dramatic decline in the share of people that get hired in any given quarter who have very little experience. And we combine this with economics in general for the past years, including my own interest, really shifting towards better understanding the implications of what the implications of recent advances in AI are for the job market. And a couple of really good pieces of work had come out recently that started to point out that there was quite a bit of evidence that occupations that have what we call really high exposure to AI, so where a lot of tasks that particular occupation has can be done by AI, seem to have these really big slowdowns, but predominantly in junior workers and younger workers. And so the argument goes that, okay, like firms are sort of replacing these younger workers with AI at faster rates, and we don't see that replacement in sort of like plumbers or other occupations where AI is hypothetically not going to replace someone's tasks. And we looked at that work, and what had always sort of been like interesting to us is that a lot of the declines that people were documenting like happened either before the release of ChatGPT 3 or like right around it. And we just thought back then, we were looking at that technology and saying, so again, maybe in Silicon Valley and in the tech worlds, you had more information on how this technology would pan out, but like for those working outside of tech, it was like, oh, we don't really know. Is this like just fancy autocomplete? Is this going to revolutionize how we do work? It was unclear. And so we thought it was weird that people would adjust a lot of their behavior around hiring either junior or older workers around this AI event. And we looked at this particular plot, we also saw, look, like that decline really starts to happen like in the year or even more prior to ChatGPT. And so we started to think, well, what else happened around that time that might be influencing the relative value of junior or less experienced to senior or more experienced workers in the workplace? Like, why might businesses or firms or hiring managers think, oh, like now I would like to really hire someone with more experience relative to a couple of years ago? And we thought, well, aside from advances in AI, one of the big things that has changed in labor markets recently is that there's been a really big shift towards remote work. Like we do a lot of more work from our homes rather than in the office. And we felt that, or we wrote down some theory that suggested that, if you think that junior workers are valuable to the company because they join as juniors and then they get trained up. So like junior software engineer joins, maybe they're not that productive when they start, but because they're coupled with us, they get to be exposed to senior software engineers, they start learning, they become more valuable to the company down the line. So that was really the sort of one main channel you were hiring juniors for. Well, if everyone's sitting at home and that tacit knowledge around software design that can't be codified, or maybe it's more difficult to monitor when people are at home rather than in the office, that's going to change the relative value of an experienced versus an inexperienced worker in the workplace. And in a lot of domains, it's really the tacit knowledge that makes people really productive. But a lot of that tacit knowledge really can't be put in an email, and it has to be learned from actual proximity to people in the office and sort of running into each other in the hall. And I'm just showing you this because what we also noticed is that, well, a lot of the exposure measures at the occupational level that were coming out at the time and are still coming out are really highly correlated also with work from home exposure. So at the top right, software developers are both high, like a lot of those tasks seem to be automatable with Gen AI, at least. My neighbor's a software engineer, he would be very upset if I said that. But the idea is that compared to someone who, like a janitor, the tasks of the software developer seem more automatable with Gen AI. But also, software developers are just much more do much more remote work than a janitor, for example, does, or a roofer. And so what we end up doing is we try to better understand, or we regress how the share of junior, so inexperienced workers, has evolved since 2017 to today. And in particular, estimate what that gradient is when we think about very high work from home exposed occupations to very low work from home. So we're basically comparing, again, software engineer or data scientists, accountants, even lawyers to people who have like electricians or cashiers who have less of a work from home exposure rank. And we see a similar pattern in that, in the occupations where there's a lot of work from home exposure, it's really the junior share has declined a lot versus the junior share in occupations where there's not a lot of work from home. Now, of course, we want to also control for Gen AI exposure, and that's exactly what we do. And so again, back to this picture, what we're really trying to exploit is sort of, if you take accountants, we're trying to keep the work from home exposure, or we can compare accountants to receptionists. And so we're going to argue that the work from home exposure there varies from accountant to receptionist, but their Gen AI exposure is roughly the same. So any sort of these points in this occupational space where you're moving from right to left or left to right are going to give you exposure changes in work from home, but less exposure changes in Gen AI. And we find that if we add this Gen AI controls, the results barely change. But when we do the opposite experiment where we say, well, what's the impact of generative AI exposure on an occupation, it's junior hiring shares, since 2017 to today, well, again, if we don't control for work from home, we see an impact. So that's the black dots. But we, if we control for work from home, that impact goes away. And the main thing here is that, of course, like we don't have really great data on exactly which firms and which occupations are adopting AI. But we do have some information from, for example, job ads, so that we can look at software engineers working at companies where we're quite sure from the postings that they do online that they started offering work from home amenities or work from home as a thing that you could do at a particular time. And so we again try to exploit this in an event study where we say, well, you know, at whatever particular year, we identify that a particular company starts doing work from home for its workers. We try to find as many similar companies as we can, size, occupational mix, geography, which city they're located in, how old the company is, but which don't offer work from home or don't offer it yet, and then show that, yeah, like over time, there doesn't seem to be any difference in those two groups of firms. But then the moment that they start offering work from home, we see this preference towards more experienced workers. So that's just my way of giving you this third example of a, I think, very interesting question, a really important question, but where causality is like really tough. And we're working really hard on trying to find some, as I've been talking about in this entire talk, some exogenous variation of work from home adoption. Some ideas we're developing are, for example, looking at companies who had like their leases expire right before COVID. And so if your lease expired, you're not going to expand your office space. So during COVID, you're going to say, oh, let's wait this out. And then you're much more likely to offer work from home. Whereas maybe if you just signed a lease before COVID, then after COVID, you probably, and we see this in the data, more likely to ask people to come back into your beautiful new offices. But I hope that this example highlights some of the trickiness around trying to find causal effects, even when we have massive data. But yeah, that's effectively all I wanted to show you. I hope that was instructive a little bit about how economists think about modeling complex systems, how we think about causal inference. And I think I've gone right to time, but Greg, I don't know if I can allow one or two questions.
Yeah, let me just add a couple of questions. So the hammers that you're summarizing, and they seem generalizable, is one is there's a suspected non-causal correlation. The one hammer is randomize it, either by forcing it, but in economics, by searching for natural randomizations. And the other one is your conditioning trick, that if you want to pull out the cause of something, you just say you condition on it if you have enough data to do so. Are those the primary tools you have available?
That's exactly right. So in an ideal world, I would condition on everything. Like someone gives me the God data set, and then I can condition on every covariate, including in the education example, cognition and all these things, my grandfather's cognition. And then I think we could convince people that, look, we've controlled for everything that could plausibly be a causal channel here, and we're done. But in practice, that almost never happens. And so that's why, yeah, the best we can sometimes do is condition on as many things that we think are reasonable, and then think about what might be threatening to us, what could be confounding, and addressing that as best as we can. Or alternatively, we find these so-called natural experiments where whatever the US government decides to do a random draft into the Vietnam War, or someone decides to do shingles vaccines for only people born after 2nd September 1933.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. And there's strong analogies to robust machine learning where you force randomness by, let's say, manipulating the backgrounds of photos to have, like, if there's polar bears on a snowy background, randomize the background to introduce variation, or, yeah, and these are specifically for a given use case. You want to maintain biasing when it's in, when you want it, and you want to remove biasing when it's destructive.
Yeah, and in my conversations with like AI ML colleagues, I think what has been really interesting to me is like if we scale and we just get more and more data, and we run like we do some deep learning on it, like, can we be more convinced of this first hammer that you mentioned, which is the conditioning? Like, are those models with sufficient data and sufficient parameters able to really condition out on everything? And then could we start to do some causal inference where we want to predict sort of what's a patient's healthcare journey if we just vary their sort of their starting age or which hospital they go to, if we've trained on the entire corpus of healthcare medical records in the US and of a 60 billion parameter model. And so I don't know the answer to that, but those are the kinds of questions that I think are really interesting. Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And if anyone has any questions, wants to reach out, I'd be more than happy to continue the conversation.